Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back to You Are From God. Today we are talking about Daniel, and we're looking at the idea of how Daniel shined and the time that he was in. And Scott, obviously there's just so much that we can learn from Daniel's situation, talking about being just around a culture and a time and a world that is totally against your beliefs and your values and your morals, but that doesn't take away the choice. And I think that's the big thing that Daniel shows us when we start reading about Daniel. You know, you talk about Daniel here early on in the book, Scott, and he's at this young age, but the background of what's happened to him up until this point and the circumstances that he finds himself in are just we might take for granted just reading through that this was a traumatic time for this young man.
Yeah, I don't know that we understand it fully, how horrible this would have been. You think about Nebuchadnezzar, you think about Babylon, and just them going in and absolutely destroying the places that they took over, and they would take the choice, young men in particular, and they would take them back. But what happened to their families? Maybe they left the women, most likely killed the men. And you just think about Daniel looking around at his city where he had lived his whole life, and it's gone. And his friends, and they're being taken to this whole new place. Everything's going to be new. They're going to have given new names, new culture, new food even. And it's just fascinating to watch how Daniel handles this situation, and how, as a young guy, him and his friends were able to continue to serve God, even in the midst of crooked and perverse generation, as we'll talk about.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, again, he has a choice, right? And in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 1, you kind of get the Bible's explanation of why he's going to do what he does. And really, the standard for his behavior the whole rest of the book, even as he grows old and as regimes change, as the leaders change, we get really bent out of shape when a leader changes in our day and time. And for some places and countries, that comes with it real tumult and distress and persecution and death even. For us in America, for those who are listening here in the States, that's not really a very common thing. We're known for a peaceful transition of power, but we can still gripe and complain about it. But I think Daniel's attitude here has something for all of us, no matter what kind of situation we find ourselves in. Verse 8 simply says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." And so there's this boldness that comes with understanding Daniel's doing this not because he wants to be a rebel, not because he wants to really stick it to the man and show King Nebuchadnezzar, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm going to do what I want. This comes from an unyielding faithfulness to God, from a young man no less, but also this idea that he's just deciding beforehand, no matter what situation I'm going to face, no matter what offers they're going to put on the table, no matter what punishments or threats come my way, I am not going to do this. And again, it's from that idea of defiling. I'm not going to do something that's going to make me unholy to my God. I'm not going to forsake him, because it's very easy perhaps for Daniel and his friends to believe, and a lot of Jews did at the time, because Babylon was saying, we beat your God. Jehovah lost. We have you captive. And so it's easy to buy into that narrative. But for Daniel, that wasn't an issue. God was still in control. He was still on his throne. And so now he's saying, you know what? I'm deciding right here and right now, moving forward, no matter what, I'm going to remain faithful. And obviously you've got some other young men that we'll talk about that are kind of with him in that effort, and that can be supports to each other. And that's so important that we have people resolved in faith together with us. But there's a lot of these young guys, Scott, that we just don't have their names because they faded into the culture. They assimilated. They took what they were given to eat. They adopted their new names fully. They spoke the language, and they just became part of the world. And it's sad. Certainly there's opportunity for them to come back at any point during their life. But Daniel here, at least at the outset, and I think that's so important to understand, at the outset says, I'm not going to be like this darkness around me. I'm going to shine bright.
Yeah, and you think about the names being changed, and we call Daniel by his Jewish name. We do not call normally Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We call them by their Babylonian name, and really it's just because they're names. We don't really think about what they mean, but the meaning of those names were so important. I love to think that Daniel still would have called his friends by their Jewish names. That's how they were known. They were not willing to change who they were just because they were in a new place. And that's difficult. Tyler, we talk about, the Bible talking about us being peculiar people. Well, people don't want to be peculiar people unless there's a reason for being a peculiar person. And for God's people, there is a reason to be a peculiar people. And that's the difficulty sometimes for us to get our heads wrapped around is really understanding what we have been called to be. I'm reminded in Philippians, in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, in verse 15 in particular, that we're called in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation to appear as lights in the world. That's our calling. That's what we are called to be in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. That's as true as it is today as it was when Paul wrote it, as it was in Babylonian times. This is what the world looks like. But this is what God's people are supposed to be. And that's hard sometimes, especially if you're so focused on the struggles and the difficulties and what seemingly looks like defeats to God's people, rather than understanding as you go on in Daniel that God was with them the whole time.
Yeah, he was in control. And that's what the next verse in verse 9 emphasizes. It's not that Daniel had some great persuasive skill. It's that God was with him in this effort to be honorable to God, to live for him, even in this situation. Verse 9 simply says, "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs." So he's asking to follow basically the conduct that he's been raised with of obeying God when it comes to the food that he eats. And so it says God's going to give him favor. There's going to be this situation that obviously the eunuch's going to have to go to the higher-ups and figure out, and he's nervous about what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to you. But it says God gave him favor. God's in control of the situation. Human free will doesn't go out the window, but God is ultimately watching over Daniel and these 3 other young men. And that's so important to realize that God is constantly working with us, especially understanding that if we're not his children, he's constantly calling us. He's putting things in our life, people in our lives, opportunities to hear and understand his word, not from somebody else's mouth necessarily, though people can play a role, but to come and read his word for what it says and just come to him openly and honestly and really give him the time of day and the thought and the consideration that he's always deserved and certainly deserves now. But even for those who are his faithful children, he is constantly at work. Going back into Philippians, I'm mindful of how Paul will start off this letter in verse 6. He says, "I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion in the day of Jesus Christ." So this idea that God's going to start the work, God's going to carry it through to completion. God is with us every single step of the way. He's the one that's helping us grow and mature and excel and all the things that we see in our lives, that these opportunities, even if they're difficult, these choices that we're making are drawing us closer to God if we're letting them, if we're focused on that end goal that our citizenship is in heaven and we're striving to live for God now and live with him in eternity. You jump into the 2nd chapter where you were just referencing a little bit earlier in verse 13, it brings up this idea that God's at work again. "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." God is helping us. This is fascinating to me, to will and to work for his good pleasure. He's going to help me actually want to do it. He's going to put the desire in my heart as I know him more. I want to live this life. I'm willing to sacrifice my connections with my friends, the opportunity to excel in this culture, any number of things in order to please God. I want that. That's my highest desire. And then he's obviously going to show me how that works, how I'm going to actually put those things into practice and do those things. And that's what you see Daniel doing in his situation. He resolves in his head, and then he has to actually take some steps and actions forward. He has to go to the eunuch and say, I want to do this. And then he gets some pushback and he says, no, this is really what I want to do. And that's where we get to this next aspect.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. Even the verses that we read. So I read Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verse 15. You read verse 13. Verse 14 says, do all things without complaining or arguments. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what is easy to do when you're going through various trials and you look around and you're just focusing on the darkness, really, and you just almost have a defeat attitude rather than understanding that God is in control. And it's okay for you to test me, as he goes on and talks about in Daniel, the 1st chapter. Just test us. And obviously, if you've read Daniel, you know that they're tested and they pass the test. And it's a beautiful thing to understand how them standing up for what they needed to do was going to continue to work because they were God's people. And that's a lesson so much for us to understand. There's a lot of, it's easy in this world to complain and to argue and to just get caught up in things and to bite and devour all the different things that the scriptures talk about. People are really good at that. And Christians can get caught up in that so quickly. I mean, we live in a time now where I can just write something down and push enter and it goes, and people can read it. And it can be just an absolute nothing but a complaint of things that are going on, and how careful we have to be about that. 1 John, the 2nd chapter, verse 8 says, "On the other hand, I am writing a new commandment to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining." I love this verse when we think about it from Daniel's perspective, because he could have looked around and saw the darkness, and it was dark, when you think about what had happened to him. But he was focusing on God, and God was with him the whole time. It maybe didn't look like it from the situation when you look around, but he absolutely was, and Daniel trusted him. That's the key, Tyler, for us, is really understanding how much we need to trust God, even when we look around and don't see the answer. God is in control, and we need to be willing to trust him. That doesn't mean it's going to end the way that we want it to every time, but it does mean that he loves me, he cares for me, and he is going to be with me.
It's just funny thinking about our last episode of Psalm 91, the trusting and the testing. Here we see Daniel's aspect of unyielding trust in God, and there's testing, but instead it's test me. Let your servants be tested, as it says in verse 12 of Daniel 1. It's, I'm going to go through the test. Some people don't like the idea of God testing us. Well, Abraham, it was said, was tested by God. It's not from the idea of, I'm trying to make you flunk. I'm not going to make this test super hard. It's simply an idea of, we're going to see what your faith is actually made of. A faith that's not tested is not a faith. We see that in so many other places in Scripture, but we understand that what proves my real allegiance in this life is when I have to make a choice, and it's going to cost me to make the choice that I do in one direction or the other. And so it's just so inspiring to look at Daniel's story, that he has suffered the loss of so much that he could easily take this road that gives him a little more comfort, a little more ease, a little more satisfaction in the temporary life, this passing darkness that he could have fully embraced, but instead he decides to shine brightly. And guess what? He still excels. God still takes care of him. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to try to throw him into a den of lions because they don't like him later on in his life, but God delivers him from that too. And so just appreciate that, listener, wherever you are this morning, spiritually speaking, when we're talking about trusting and testing these past 2 weeks, that there are tests all around us every single day. You can look at every single choice you make as a test, but it's an opportunity to see God, to lean on him, to trust him, and to fully immerse yourself in pursuing what he has desired for us, that he would make us desire the things that he desires for us, and that we could work and do the things that are pleasing to him, all so that we can be bright, shining lights in this world. It's not us that makes us different. It's because we are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.